I could have just done it, but
Yeah.
I don't want to take the privilege away from you.
Oh, you're so considerate. I really appreciate it. Okay, I need to open the document and yeah. Okay. Um, well now I can share it. Yeah, there it is. Okay, fine. Okay, so as I think you know, this book was just published, literally hot off the presses, and people have sometimes have asked me, have I run out of ethical issues to discuss after over 5 years of discussing them? And frankly, I was getting a little concerned because we have discussed, I think, some of the more prominent issues, but this book was just published, and now we have many issues, and I just mentioned that in the table of contents. They includes personal and business ethics, ritual, personal status, women, LGBTQIA plus, medical ethics, COVID pandemic, relationships with the other, the modern state of Israel, and life in the United States. In other words, there are 10 chapters. Now, we have covered some of the issues that she mentions, which is okay. And what she sometimes does is she'll, for example, this issue of transgender, where she does have a discussion of the teshuva that we are reading, but she brings it in a very shortened form. So the good news is that it gives me and you an opportunity to look at the full teshuva, and we can discuss it at length. Uh, but I also note that if you look at the book, she has she makes reference to a study guide. The study guide I just took from the internet. It was published by the Jewish Publication Society of America, the book, and then on their webpage, they have study guides for some of the books that they publish. They publish really extraordinary and important books for American Jewish life. And from the study guide that she has in the study guide 12 general questions. And I just want to point out one or two that we're looking at. And when we take a look at the Teshuvah by Rabbi Sharzer, we might want to ask some of the questions that she does. For example, what's the background? We know that we're talking about someone who's both a physician and a rabbi. And how does the rabbinic decisive start? What might influence? What sources are cited? What about the contesting points of view? And actually, if we take a look at this, let's go now. And we've seen there are many questions about this. And actually, she has some very specific questions about what we're studying. How does Rabbi Sharzer shape the question? Um, what does he think the challenge is? Why does he begin? Notice, right? Let's go back. We're going to go back and forth a little bit today. Let's pull up the teshuva. Oh, there it is. Okay. Okay. While we see that he begins with the questions, right, which are very much within the general definition of halacha, what are the specific rules? But when he starts to answer it, right? When he starts to answer it, what does he do? And again, we could say how do you begin the answer? You could begin the answer by looking at the biblical text. You could begin the answer by reference to previous rabbinic works. You can begin the answer in one of many ways. But notice, and we can mention, what does he do? He talks about language, right? The issue of what is the realia of how transgender people live. And rather than start with the questions, he gives us rather a whole background, which he's going to use. And note he uses it with his knowledge as a physician. Halacha is binary. And then he goes on with other questions about Judaism being an
Alex,
religion. He defines terms, right? So actually we're and then talks about strategies for gender assignment. In other words, he doesn't begin with, okay, how do we know if somebody's male or female? Which he could. What did Rabbi Rabinowitz say about it? Which he could. What about Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg? What did he have to say about it? Which he could. But he, as a physician, is essentially saying the modern medical scientific knowledge and the realia of transgender people in society first need to be discussed before we even take a look at the biblical texts or the rabbinic texts, right? Why is he doing that? By the way, why is he doing that? Anyone suggest any answers as to why he's doing it that way? Do you think it was a good idea to do it that way? Appropriate? Bad idea? Did it help you understand the issues? Any wait? Any comment here? No? Okay. Well, I think what he is doing is he is saying very directly, we can't start with the rabbinic texts. We can't start with the traditional outlook. We have to start with the most up-to-date, objective, modern understanding of a topic which did not get discussed with these concepts in the past, right? I know. I think Jack, you asked what did Maimonides or Rashi say about this? Well, Maimonides and Rashi didn't say too much about this because this was not part of the realia, the objective realia of their time. So so all of a sudden he's starting, right? He's not going to start answering the questions. Till page 11, right? Notice that. Halachic approach, page 11. So we have 10 and a half pages of background before we even start asking the questions of Jewish law. And I think it's very important as we see that, when with Rabbi Barmash, who is the editor of the book that I mentioned. Let's go back for a second. Okay. Right. How does he shape the questions? He shapes them by saying, I wanted you to understand what we're talking about, and I want you to understand our understanding of gender today, which is not part of the understanding of this question from the past. And that's, he's starting with all of that. Why does he explain medical issues? Right? You'll notice that some of the other materials we've seen have not gone into the depth of understanding of medical issues. When Rabbi Barmash also asks that question, background, that he's a doctor. Had he not been a doctor, I don't think anybody on the law committee has this depth of understanding that he brings to this. How does he start? Well, I want you to understand when we're talking about transgender, let's understand what we're talking about. Unfortunately, today, okay, here we go, getting on the soapbox. Transgender discussion is sometimes about politics and not about medical and scientific knowledge, i.e., transgender is discussed within a political context that certain things are right and certain things are wrong. Well, how about starting by understanding transgender on its own terms? Did you follow the Supreme Court last week? They're going to be asked a question about a law in the state of Tennessee, of all places. And So he's going to start from what does he cite? He cites, sources about realia and medical, what is his um, uh, line of argument? And the assumption he's making, by the way, is that modern medical understanding of gender must influence how we understand halacha, right? We cannot ignore the reality of transgender people in society. Not only can we not ignore, that has to become an important part of our decision making. And two, we have to be sure that we're talking about this scientifically, medically, up to date. That's his assumptions. Not every person's going to make that assumption, right? We have some other traditional sources will say, who cares about that? And we'll have some people in the political viewpoints that say, okay, politically, this is a decisive issue, and we can gain political points by making some assumptions about this. Okay, comments about that at all? Questions? Okay, so I think I'm glad to see that we have this study guide that Rabbi Barmash put together that helps us. Okay, so let's get back to the text itself. Here. Right, okay. Last time, let's go back to the beginning and then just a quick summary, and then we'll pick it up from where we were last time. Let's go back to as they say, take it from the top. I know I could probably, okay. All right. Again, this is a teshuva. He starts by giving an introduction about when he says the Jewish community in the larger culture, transgender people have been excluded, marginalized, harassed, or worse. So he tries to talk about the language challenge, right? He makes some statements about, halacha is binary, either you're male or female, and that Judaism talks about men and women in very concrete terms. And he defines all the terms. And then he talks about strategies for how do you know? How do you know? No. Oh, for some people, it's very obvious. It's very simple, right? Gender is a binary social construct related to, but not identical with various dimensions of human sexual biology. And he points out that human biology is not binary. And he gives us some examples. And we are, that's where we're up to, page 7. Okay, right here. Okay. By the way, about therapy, I asked Rabbi Dorf also a question about therapy and that's the issue in front of the Supreme Court. And he said, a little modesty is necessary here, and that one must be careful about certain types of irreversible therapy. And it's unclear as to when exactly that is best to be allowed for legally. That's part of what's being discussed. Okay. All right. Right. So the question is, how do you determine is someone male or female? And he points out again, you can't just say it's clear and obvious. There's no question about it. He points out that the genetic sex does not have a one-to-one relationship with your chromosomes. It's not binary. He points out that the hormones status is not binary. You can find someone with male hormones or female hormones or different amounts of one or the other. It's not so clear. And then he talks about what's this question of gender identity. Gender identity is a lifelong, unchangeable. Gender expression may change, but not gender identity. Are we clear what that means? So what is he saying? If someone identifies as male or female, that's one sense of oneself. They may express it in different ways. That can change. But the sense of who one is, there may be a biological basis for gender identity, but we're not sure yet. Okay, so we need to have some modesty there. Gender describes the internal map of the self, the framework through which the self meets the embodied. The term transgender refers to a wide range of people, right? Again, this idea that everything fits into he's also, one of the things he's making very clear in this teshuva is that our categories aren't so simple. If you have to see the world in a binary fashion, transgender really challenges that notion. Okay. Some find that neither of the legally sanctioned categories describe their gender and know themselves to be neither men nor women. Some find that they are, and their internal sense of gender and their internally held maps of their physical body differ from the bodies which they inhabit, while others feel quite at home in their bodies, but struggle with the assumptions that are made about their gender because of their physical appearance. All of these and more are true experiences of being transgender, and people with all these experiences are sometimes united by living in the margins of gender in our culture. Again, Rabbi Sharza puts this into his teshuvah to say to us the categorization that we normally hold in the real world, it's a little messier, not as clear. Wouldn't we like it if everything fit into a perfect category and there's no question? And halakha, Jewish law, likes to do that. But here we have something that doesn't help us, okay? So this is something we've seen already in the Rabinowitz Teshuva, Strategies in Classic. Now, again, this could have been his first paragraph, right? One could argue why, this is a classic Jewish question. Why didn't his teshuva begin right here? Why didn't he just begin with strategies in classic and contemporary halakhic discourse, right? As a matter of fact, so the whole first 10 and a half pages didn't have to be there. But he feels that this is an absolute necessity for us to understand the issue, okay? And he says classical and contemporary halakhic sources are not particularly helpful on the question of changing gender, right? He gives an example. Excuse me. In the case of Ruvain, who married a woman, a virgin, as one marries a Jewish woman, and lived with her as husband and wife, and after so many years, an incident occurred in which she was changed from female to male in all ways and in every particular. By the way, what's odd about that statement? What's odd about that statement?
It doesn't say exactly what incident occurred.
What happened? Right.
Yeah.
One day,
What happened?
I feel like I'm in a Kafka story. One day, George woke up as Georgina. I mean, I don't know, right? I don't want to make fun of this, but I mean, it's a very peculiar statement, is it not? How did that happen? Is it in anyone's real realia world experience that and he says from female to male in all ways and in every particular. Their anatomy changed overnight? I don't know. It's a very peculiar statement. So if you start with a halacha, with the traditional Jewish sources, this is where you start. And obviously Rabbi Sharsa thinks, no, that's not a good place to start. Now he's quoting.
Rabbi,
Right. Yeah. I'm sorry, Jack, yeah.
I was going to say, isn't some of this God's will? What God wants has his influence on this?
Well, whatever we say about God's will, there are rules in the physical world. And what it seems here is that the rules that we understand the physical world to abide by, in this particular case, it's I don't know why this happened or how this happened. It's just it's almost as if we are creating a situation that we're just doing this for an intellectual sense. I don't know if it's God's will. I mean, it's just very odd. Now, the good part of this is that, okay, there is at least something in the tradition we can look back on. But how do we approach it? I don't know if it's God's will or not. Something I mean, it's very, very peculiar. As a matter of fact, Rabbi Sharza said Um, as if by magic, a woman becomes a man. No mention of her role. It's simply something. Whatever the description is meant to denote, it is simply not what we find in the experience of a transgender person. People don't wake up one morning and say, oops, I was wrong my entire life, and now I want to be the other gender. Right. So you're, in a sense, Jack, he is saying we have to use science and objective reality to measure how we respond to this. Okay. This just doesn't happen in the real world, right? People who don't one day magically transform to the other. Rather, there are people in whom is an incongruity between the most deeply held sense of themselves as gendered individuals and the gender assigned to them at birth, people who demand and deserve to live fully and authentically in a Jewish context. In other words, the reality is it doesn't happen like that. And that's what the expression is. So in summary to this whole first part of the paper, again, what she puts here, he says, none of the dimensions of sex gender is strictly binary, right? There are incongruities and mismatches. This is consistent with the rabbinic understanding that even though halakhic gender categories are binary, people are not, i.e., the rabbis recognize that even physically, sometimes there were people who were born and it was unclear what gender they were. Again, not to argue, as we saw that first, the Reform rabbis say, see, the rabbis are talking about a brand new gender. No, they're not talking about a brand new gender. They're saying we have two categories and we have some people who don't seem to fit. Okay, and what do we do about that? When gender is related, we should approach the people affected as individuals, recognizing there will be inconsistencies, incongruities, and contradictions. That's really tough for a binary system to deal with, right? For the vast majority of such questions, gender identity will serve as best and most appropriate criteria. Gender identity, right? He's not saying physical features. Right? He could be saying right here, and remember Rabbi Rabinowitz in his teshuva had said physical characteristics determine within the system of Jewish law whether or not we consider somebody male or female. Rabbi Sharzer is saying no. He's saying it's gender identity, which is sometimes, but sometimes not, related to physical characteristics, chromosomes, hormones, and sexual organs. Gender identity. It is most closely aligned with that person's sense of self, their soul essence, and consistent with the principles of respect, honor, and dignity. In infants, it is appropriate to assign gender on the basis of anatomy, knowing that in the majority of cases, it will match gender identity. Okay, that's great. But, here's an important but, recognizing that in a significant number of people, it will not. Once the person, child, adolescent, or adult has the understanding and vocabulary to assert a gender identity, it is that which should be honored. I.e., he is saying, if somebody says, this is my gender identity, no matter what their physical condition is, no matter what type of genitals they have, no matter how many chromosomes, X or Y, hormones, nope. It's this person's inner sense of self. Here he is again saying, modern psychological understandings override some understandings we may have had in the past. In the past, it was based, okay, on physical symptoms, on physical characteristics. That doesn't work. So he is saying that, yes, our modern understanding of the psyche has to come first in our understanding and in approaching the halacha. Okay. Adopting this strategy is not about acceding to whatever people want, all right? Again, here's where the politics comes in. People will on different sides of the political spectrum will say, oh, the world's going to hell if you don't know who's the man and who's the woman. Oh, we can't even decide who's a man and who's a woman. Uh-oh, everything's going to hell. No, doesn't mean that. Transgender people do not That should be do, not to. Sorry, there's some typos in this. Do not choose or want their gender identity any more than cisgender people choose or want theirs. Wow. I mean, that's a very strong statement. Oh, this one's choosing to be male today and female tomorrow. You hear all sorts of crazy stuff. Excuse me. Rather, it is a core element of a person's being and does not seem to be subject to deliberate attempts to change. Now, look, you can't be, we're still at a somewhat early understanding of some of he himself expresses this. We don't fully understand everything here, but based upon our understanding today, it is a core element of a person's being. Okay, so that's how he starts, 10.5 pages. Now we're going to talk about halacha, rather than start without that. Okay, comment or question to this point? Carol, yes.
Regardless, is he saying regardless of the DNA?
Yes. Well, he talks about the chromosomes, right? He goes right back up here. He says, though most people are born with an XX or XY chromosome, which makes you male or female traditionally. Some people are born XXY or XYY or XXY. Hybrids or other variations. That's your DNA. He says it doesn't necessarily matter.
One thing he left out is you can also have some cells that are XX and other cells that are XY in the same person.
Okay, that I'm not aware of, but okay, let's say we could add that. In other words, again, he is saying that our modern scientific proof of what we see in front of us is going to influence how we understand this in the issue of Jewish law. Okay, Carol, go ahead.
Okay, but I'm confused in that if you are born, let's say, with an XX,
Okay.
and you identify as a male, and that's okay?
He's not saying that's okay. He's saying that's real. That's the real world.
The real world, regardless of all your chromosomes,
Yes, that's exactly what he is saying. He is saying a person can be born with chromosomes, DNA that we associate, and we say for the vast, vast majority of people with those chromosomes, that means they're male or female, but that person's in the internal sense of gender may not match that.
Okay.
That's exactly what he's saying. Okay. Chromosomes are not determinative. And he's even saying we're not sure exactly what is determinative, but we do know that people with one set of chromosomes may have an inner sense that that is not determining their gender. It might determine their genitals, right? But it doesn't necessarily determine their gender. Now, by the way, we're talking about a small percentage of people. But again, when you're talking about 350 billion Americans, that's even a small percentage is a number of people.
I always thought that chromosomes were determinative of gender.
Right.
It's an abnormal chromosome.
Right. Right. I mean, and some people would say that today, but he is a doctor, and I have to take his word as a doctor that he is knowledgeable in this area. Again, notice this is what he's doing for more than half of about a third of this teshuva is an attempt to say, let's just be clear. Gender is not determined necessarily by hormones, DNA, or genitals. One's sense of gender may be at odds, but in various ways at odds. A little at odds, a lot at odds, totally at odds, totally congruent. This is more of a not a binary, but what's the word? It's a gradual axis, and real people find themselves in different positions on this axis. Okay, my DNA says I'm a male, and I'm not so sure about that, or I don't feel like a male, or sometimes I feel like a male, and sometimes I feel like a female. And that internal sense, he's saying, is more determinative than the chromosomes. That's what he's saying. Now again, I'm not a doctor. I'm just assuming And we see that for him, this is primary. That's why he's spending half of the teshuvah right at the beginning to tell us this. Because, had you not read this, I think many of us, I certainly have learned a great deal by reading this. And part of the some of the discussion in the political world is, well, if we don't have the binary X, X, Y, X, Y, then again, the world's going to hell, right? But that is more, I think, of a description of a type of mindset rather that tries to impose itself upon the evidence. And Rabbi Sharzer is saying, let's take a look at the evidence, let's take a look at the medicine, let's take a look at the science, and go from there, rather than go from a mindset that says everything has to be X or Y, or XX and XY. Right. That's what he's saying. Okay, Rini.
Well, for those of us who feel that we are what we are, it's pretty hard to imagine feeling anything else. I think that's one of the issues that, how could someone who looks like a girl feel like a boy? But
Right.
we do have a friend whose granddaughter, when she was a teenager, realized she wanted to be their grandson. And they went through, psychotherapy and all this stuff. And she eventually, over her puberty and later on, became a man who I think he either is in his senior year or just graduated from college and is very happy to be male. He was not happy as a girl, even though he had all the physical characteristics of a girl. And it was very hard for the family to wrap their heads around that. And I think that's because we're used to just boys are boys and girls are girls. And it's hard to imagine for those of us who feel we're in the right gender and the right sex to understand how there could be that conflict. And I think what he's saying here is very, very helpful.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely correct. I mean, this does take an imaginative leap from the way we normally see things. And I think you're correct in that it is very hard to take that leap when all one knows from one's own personal experience. Well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? Well, no, it's not. To fully understand what it might be like with a different gender identity than what one was born with, or what one's physical characteristics say. Yeah, you're right. It's a very hard leap, and there are some people who think that leap is impossible, or people are just choosing it, off of the top of their head one day. One day they decide that this is not what we're talking about. Okay. All right. Any other comments or questions before we now finally, this is the teshuvah. We're finally talking about halacha, Jewish law, right? And he is very, very strongly made that point that you got to understand all this before you want to make some decisions. And there are a lot of questions that are raised by this as far as how Jewish law looks at, understands you, because there are very specific rituals, and as he pointed out, halacha is binary. So, right? Yeah, there are most of the questions address what is the halakhic status of a person who has undergone sex reassignment surgery. That was the question for Rabbi Rabinowitz, right? Rabbi Rabinowitz very clearly said the person who goes has SRS, what's called sex reassignment surgery, which is, by the way, that term has been, I learn something new every day. It's replaced by gender confirming or gender affirming surgery. Isn't that interesting, the way we use language? Sex reassignment, i.e., I'm changing you, versus gender confirming, I'm just affirming what already exists. Notice how the language is used and how it actually gives us a whole different conceptual framework to understand the surgery. It's not reassignment, it's just affirming. Okay? Saying that surgery does affect the change, right? Some rabbis also address the question whether the surgery is permitted, right? We're not permitted to abuse our bodies, so isn't that type of surgery prohibited? And what about after the fact? Okay, all right. Pre-modern rabbis, what are they? What are they? Excuse me. Sorry. My constant upper respiratory infections. What are the consequences when a man or a woman, as a result of an apparently spontaneous event, becomes the opposite sex? Right. We just had that question before. What about marital status? What is the status of the marriage? Is a Jewish divorce necessary? Is the marriage dissolved by the change, or is a get necessary? And he points out, that sort of discussion does not account for the majority of transgender men and significant number of trans women who do not undergo surgery. Right. Well, what about people who don't have surgery, or some parts of the surgery, or don't have it at all? Again, it's a spectrum. It's not a binary. And how does that fit into our understanding, right? I have chosen to frame the questions differently, exactly the specific questions in relation to trans people based on their gender identity rather than their operative status. Unlike Rabbi Rabinowitz, who said, I'll deal with it when they have the surgery. No, Rabbi Sharzer is saying, let's deal with it as their gender identity, and we're not talking about their physical features. That is a radical statement in opposition to what Rabbi Rabinowitz said in the teshuvah that we looked at. So he's got some very simple questions: conversion, divorce, marriage, gender confirming surgery, hormones, pregnancy in trans men. I hadn't even thought about that one. General medical care, preparation for burial. What about nidah? Going to the mikveh. Does someone whose gender is now changed, do they still have to go to the laws of going to the mikveh apply if they've not had surgery and they have it's complicated? What about brit milah? Okay. What about the endpoint of the transition? Do we have to have a ritual to mark it? Right, rituals, change of name, synagogue rituals. Ta'amod, Ya'amod, how do we call them up to the Torah? Do we use a mask? Hebrew is a gendered language, right? And so on. Okay, so let's deal. So now he's going to break down what he sees as the issues from the view of Jewish law. Conversion, a good question. The appropriate conversion ritual for transgender men and women who seek to convert. In the case of cisgender people, all converts require immersion in a mikveh. Well, that's pretty standard procedure. I've certainly been involved in innumerable numbers of cases like that. However, men require either ritual circumcision, or if they've been previously circumcised, what's called hatafat dam brit. Okay, he's going to shorten that HDB. Okay, literally hatafat, a drop of blood of the covenant. Drawing a drop of blood from the site of the circumcision scar. You usually get a doctor, and those little probes that people with diabetes have, the spring-loaded probes that people sometimes with diabetes it gets a drop of blood from their finger so they can check out their blood sugar. That type of probe. Okay, so what about men who have suffered the loss of their penis from trauma or cancer surgery? Can they convert to Judaism? This is a regular male, cisgender male, but does not have a penis. What do we do? A non-Jew who converts to Judaism must be circumcised. If he was circumcised previously, a drop of blood is drawn. If his penis has been amputated, cancer, accident, there are possible ways. The impossibility of a circumcision, excuse me, is not a barrier to conversion, and the immersion suffices. What's the concept? If something has happened which a person did not choose to do this, but because of medical necessity or because of an accident, they can no longer do this. We understand that. And it's okay still. You can convert. What about a person who is nolad mahul, born circumcised? They never had a foreskin. It happens. And he points out what the rabbis was concerned about was someone who appeared circumcised, but nevertheless had a foreskin which was somehow shrunken or hidden and would manifest itself at some time in the future, and the man would seem uncircumcised. That could be a problem. So what do the rabbis say? Some rabbis demanded hatifat dam brit for all men who have not undergone circumcision, even if they appear to be circumcised. So this is a different category. This is one whose foreskin never developed. Okay, it happens. So they still need hatifat dam brit. Okay. What about trans men who have undergone some form of genital surgery and trans women who have not, who are often emotionally fraught and require sensitivity and compassion? One can imagine so. Issues of shame and embarrassment. And he just basically says, we have to be very conscious of the sensitivities. Some rabbis have even questioned whether it's appropriate to ask questions of a trans woman conversion candidate that they would never ask of a cis woman. Excuse me, do you have a penis? We shouldn't do that. Okay. And he points out that in proposing rituals to transgender converts, I would make an analogy to the medical setting. If a physician is to examine a trans woman, she should be treated like any woman patient. She should be addressed as a woman, a chaperone should be present during examination, and she should be modestly draped. If she has a prostate, the physician would be remiss not to examine. Similarly, a trans man should be treated like all male patients, but if he needs a pap smear, the physician must do it. So he comes, he gives you some various rules that he feels that we're dealing in new areas. I will admit, in my experience as a rabbi, I've never had the case of a transgender person who came to me asking for conversion. My guess is that some of my colleagues have, and this will probably become something that we'll see happen in the future. Okay. Trans men who have not undergone genital surgery don't require circumcision or hatifat dam brit. Trans men who have undergone surgery, neither technique creates a foreskin, so they don't require anything. Trans women who have undergone genital surgery, so there's no foreskin. So that's that immersion. No, trans women who have not undergone genital surgery have a penis, which may or may not have been circumcised. In addition to questioning the appropriateness of a conversation about the genitalia, some rabbis have asked whether the mitzvah of circumcision applies to trans women. It seems to me that it does. So he says, yeah, we do have to do hatifat dam brit. He says he bases this on anatomy. A person who has a penis, whatever their gender identity requires circumcision or hatifat dam brit. A person who does not. That's pretty simple and straightforward. Okay. Okay, I think we can go down. What about immersion? Now, in a mikvah, you have to go into a mikvah without any clothes on. Typically, if a male is being converted, we have male rabbis watching. If a female is being converted, the male rabbis are outside the door of the mikvah. A woman is, we find a woman who we trust, and the woman is inside the mikvah, and the woman yells out to the rabbis on the other side of the door, okay, she immersed, and we don't see anything, right? Okay. So there's a question of modesty. Immersion should be witnessed by someone who can assure that the immersions are performed correctly. of whatever gender the candidate is most comfortable with, and usually a person of the same gender identity. He has an alternative. The Israeli rabbinate for female converts to wear a black loose-fitting robe into the mikveh, so the dayanim, the witnesses, can observe the tevilah, the immersion. Any clothing should be as permissible as long as the water gets through it. Okay, so what is this issue here? Is tzniut, modesty, right? So we should, alleviate their anxieties. Okay, marriage. Now here's a very critical issue. What happens to a marriage if someone changes their gender? Okay, and that's a problem because until recently, there's no uniformity in the United States as to whether states recognize same-sex marriages. Some states, same-sex marriages is recognized throughout the United States. There's still no uniformity to legal gender status or gender identity documents for transgender individuals. It is incumbent upon the rabbi solemnizing a Jewish marriage to be aware of the laws that apply in the particular jurisdiction in which the ceremony takes place. Rabbis, when they form a wedding, officiated a wedding, are acting not only as rabbis, but also as people who are enforcing the rules of the state. So you have to, if you're going to do a wedding, you have to be consistent with the rules of the state of the place that you were performing it. Okay. So what about the solemnizing the marriage of transgender Jews? Okay. What they suggest is that they have a different type of ritual for the marriage. As it is saying, there are rituals now which have been created for same-sex couples. There's a ketubah for a same-sex couple. There are a whole series of rituals for a same-sex couple, which are not the same thing as for a marriage, which Jewish law recognizes with people of different sexes, kiddushin. They are different from kiddushin, but still a Jewish marriage. Okay, makes that point. Right. The Committee of Jewish Law Standards is that opposite-sex couples may be married only by kiddushin, and only opposite-sex couples can be married by kiddushin. Therefore, the marriage between a male-identified person and a female-identified person is sanctified by kiddushin. All other unions are sanctified by a different type of ceremony, shutafut, rit ahuvim, as is described. Okay. Well, what about someone who's been married already and has a transition? What do you do then? Okay. What if the couple desires to remain married? The marriage remains valid and there is no requirement for any ritual. Okay. Okay. And okay, divorce. Like marriage, divorce is an asymmetrical enterprise. The man may divorce his wife, but a woman may not divorce her husband. There are some real issues. And Rabbi Rabinowitz deals with the situation of a marriage in which the husband transitions, which according to Rabbi Rabinowitz must include genital surgery. All right, he cites sources that say that since the woman was married to a man and the man is now a woman, the wife is no longer an eshet ish, a man's wife, and therefore does not require a get. So the marriage has been dissolved. Okay. Now what does he say? The notion that a marriage is automatically dissolved when one person transitions does a disservice both to those couples who will wish to remain together and to those who decide to dissolve the marriage and desire to closure in a Jewish context. In other words, from Rabbi Rabinowitz's position, you don't need a get. Once a person fully transitions, the marriage is gone. But Rabbi Sharzer is disagreeing. And something that we came across when we talked about Rabbi Rabinowitz. If the couple is certain they want to divorce, they should be encouraged to do so before their transition process is complete. You may recall we talked about that when we talked about Rabbi Rabinowitz. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. Okay. And in many, perhaps most cases, the person's gender identity has not changed. So they talk about you should have the get beforehand. And if a trans woman refuses to give a get to the woman he has been married to prior to his transitioning, it is imperative to release the woman from her status of being married. Let's understand what that means. There's a marriage, right? The one who was male now transitions to being a woman, refuses to give a get because traditionally the husband has to give a get. That's the same problem as if a male. It doesn't matter whether this person has transitioned or not. So he suggests that the marriage be annulled. Okay. Some biomedical issues. Well, what do you do about individuals whose genitals are not clear? Here again, where does he start? Now, we could start, remember, with all those definitions the rabbis had of people whose genitals are not clear when they're born, and there were the several different ones. He's saying now, let's take a look at where we are, first of all, scientifically. And in the past, Dr. John Money, a highly regarded psychologist and an authority on gender, Professor Johns Hopkins, held that a person's sense of gender identity was malleable until about 18 months of age. Obviously, something that Rabbi Scharz is going to disagree with. He therefore concluded that those born with ambiguous genitalia could have their sex surgically assigned as infants and later hormonally regulated without negative consequences. That we know is no longer the case. Moni's theory enjoyed acceptance. His recommendations in cases of ambiguity, or whatever the cause, was that the genitals should be altered to resemble as closely as possible the genitalia of one sex or another. That was the accepted medical view. Right? Interestingly, Moni believed that once gender identity was established, as in the case of transsexual adults, it was fixed. And he supported sex reassignment surgery to confer the individual's professed gender. Well, let's take a look at a real case. Rabbi Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg, modern, i.e., he lived in the modern world. I don't mean modern by saying like he's modern Orthodox. No, he was a very traditional person, but he lived, in the 20th century. Okay, so here's somebody who's living in the 20th century. A case of a intersex baby at Tel HaShomer Hospital. A baby who was thought to be female was noted to have a lump on one side of the labia. It was a rudimentary testes. Okay, Waldenberg ruled, okay, that the testicular mass should be removed and the genitalia altered to be more female, as the child would be raised as a girl. Clearly, he and the medical staff were acting in accord with the now discredited theories of Dr. Moni. There is no information, but late research studies underway to the best treatment for children with intersex conditions, but general principles include informed and open discussions. The gender assignment be made on the basis of the best available information with an openness to the idea that the child may develop a gender identity different from that originally assigned, and especially that no surgery be performed until the patient is old enough to understand and agree. See, as opposed to the idea that you, at the time of birth, if it's a little unclear, you make a decision. What Rabbi Scharz is saying, we don't do that. Okay. A few more. Oh, we're almost done. Okay. Let's see. This is just to go quickly over some of this. Can we permit surgery? And he points out that the question is surgery, is there a prohibition against self-wounding? Does it violate the prohibition against placing oneself in a dangerous situation? Is it unnatural and prohibited? And we certainly have a biblical prohibition against castration. So if surgery is done to alleviate pain and with the consent of the patient, then the wounding does not violate the prohibition. In other words, he's basically saying, in general, we do have some concerns about genital surgery, but he talks about psychological pain. Pikuach nefesh, saving a life would override any halakhic objection to the surgery, but even absent threat to life, and genital surgery is not about threats to life, symptoms of pain and distress, to the extent they can be relieved by surgery, are certainly enough to overcome objections based upon the prohibitions of self-wounding and endangerment. In other words, he's saying, typically we would say, no, you shouldn't have the surgery because you're wounding yourself and you're endangering your health by having surgery. But he is saying we allow it because of the psychological pain and distress that it would cause. Okay, about time. We're just about out of time. Okay, the comments or questions before we're almost done. We'll finish next time. Comments or questions? No?
Very
Yes?
confusing. I'm glad I'm not a rabbi on the committee.
Well, again, what if we look at Rabbi Barmash's question, which is very simple, what is his basis for starting this teshuva with all the medical and other information about the reality of transsexualism? That is where he begins, not with, okay, what's happened in the past. Let's begin with let's start with that question that, a man wakes up one day and is now a woman. Let's not start with that. Let's start someplace else. And he does. And I think we can see how the conclusions follow from that. Okay. All right.
I'm sure the Orthodox have a different point of view on this.
Well, we've already seen, remember, we did look at that briefly.
Yes, but
That
I don't think they would buy into all his medical explanations, because if it's not binary, it's difficult for them, I think.
Yeah, well, the right. In other words, their point of departure would not be, let's look at the most modern medical understanding. Let's look at the realia of transgender people in society, and let's understand that before we even begin to look at the halakha. That's what he's saying. Yeah. And the more, we did look at an Orthodox view about that, which did not begin in that way.
Right.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yeah, Judith.
Do they ever go and look back at these questions and teshuvas? Because, for instance, 20 years ago, the answer might be different than it is today with what we know and what is being done. So is this open to further discussion down the line?
Everything is open to further discussion down the line. We saw the Rabbi Rabinowitz discussion, which was very simple. You only can be considered by Jewish law to have changed your gender identity if you have fully physically changed your body, right? That's what he said
Right.
a little over 20 years ago. And Rabbi Schauser is actually saying no. So in other words, again, that's a conceptual understanding. You mean when we have further scientific understanding of the world, that further scientific understanding of the world is going to override some decisions we made 20 years ago? The answer is yes. At least for our movement. Yeah, Jack?
Well, my feeling is that I think the rabbi who said you should not do any surgery until the child can make their own decision, I think that makes wonderful sense, well, most common sense, because how can you want to decide for somebody else at an adult age?
Well, but notice that Rabbi Waltenberg said the opposite, right? He quotes the very traditional rabbi in Tel Aviv who is asked and makes a decision that is the opposite of what Rabbi Schauser is suggesting. Okay, any other comments, questions? Well,
Jack, I have to run. Call me.
okay. Take care, everyone. Oh, in December, we're gonna meet, we will not meet the last week of December. We're gonna meet, obviously, what's today, the 10th, the 17th, and the 24th, but we're not gonna meet on the 31st. We'll take 1 week off the end of December. Okay?
Okay.
Okay, feel
Everyone-
better. Thank you.
Thank you. Everyone have a good day. Take
You
care.
too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.